Hi everyone, welcome to On Board at the Candidates, where I'm going to be picking one game per day and then trying to demystifying it. So I'm going to be pitching it at sort of non-master level, so sort of 2000, below 2000, and hopefully there'll be learning points that everyone can apply to their game. So in the first round, I picked the game Nepo against Abasov, and so it started off with 1d4, and Nepo replied with taking the game into sort of the Queen's Gambit, declined. So it's fairly common where White brings his bishop out to g5 here, pinning this knight against the Queen. And Nepo very solidly replied with bishop e7. Abasov carried on with his development, playing e3, and Nepo played h6. So not the most sort of common move order this, but perfectly normal. H6 is kind of useful. It's kicking that bishop. It's making White make a decision basically. One downside potentially of it is that when pawns move forward, they can't move back, and in the future, potentially, there may be issues with this g6 square, or it may limit Black's options later on. If he wants to play something like f6, then the g6 square is going to be weaker. Whenever you push a pawn forward, you should always be thinking, what squares am I leaving behind? Does it matter? Okay, so not a problem here, but it's just something to bear in mind in the future. Abasov retreated, and Nepo played quite a rare move, indicating that he wants to be very, very solid in this first round game. He took on c4. More common is something like castles, and then the game just continues down a completely different route. So, very logical, Abasov took back, and Nepo struck at the center with c5. It's really, really important that you don't just allow your opponents to take over the center freely. It's always important that you have some form of presence in the center. And if you just continued with something like castles, then eventually, potentially, White might be able to get e4 in and just occupy this center, have more space, and it's so much easier then to sort of launch an attack potentially on the king. Okay, so c5 was played, and Abasov responded by going knight f3. So again, very logical move, developing, sticking to these opening rules, developing very quickly. Nepo took on d4, and now White has a decision to make. He can take back with the knight, keeping the pawn structure symmetrical, or more ambitiously taking back with the e-pawn. Now that gives him this isolated queen pawn in the middle of the board. When I say isolated queen pawn, it means that no other pawns can protect it. So the c file and the e file do not have any white pawns. So this pawn on d4 is on its own. There are pros and cons of having an isolated pawn. So it could potentially be a weakness in the future, since no other pawns can protect it. However, it does free up some files for your rooks, and it does give you some attacking potential. So knight c6 was played. Again, typical nice developing move, sticking to the basics. Castles. So we're coming towards the end of the opening. Both sides have developed quickly. Black still hasn't got a home for this c8 bishop. And all White has to do now is connect the rooks to complete the sort of the four basic opening rules that I can't tell all my students to follow. Abasov just improves the position of his rook. So as I mentioned earlier with the isolated queen pawn, one of the good things about it is that you do have this nice E file and C file for your rooks. In addition, you've got some nice squares potentially to land knights on, especially this E5 square. So if this knight goes to E5, eventually this rook on E1 will be protecting it. And now, as I mentioned, that bishop on C8 doesn't have a home yet, and Nepo's next move is intended to try and make it a home on B7. So he plays A6 with the idea of going B5. So that would be with a tempo. We're always trying to do things with threats so that we gain time. So if he plays B5, then we'd be threatening this bishop on C4. Okay, so be gaining time because white will have to move that bishop. Rook C1 is played. So again, Abasov sticking to the basics. I always tell my students, ask yourself which of your pieces are being lazy. What is not doing anything? So in this position, most of the pieces are working quite hard, but we have this rook sitting on A1 that is not doing anything. So what's a better square? Where do rooks like to live? They like to live on open files, ideally. They've got more scope for doing stuff. Okay, so Nepo responds with B5, hitting this bishop and gaining time, as we said. So Abasov has to move it out of the way somewhere. Otherwise, he's going to lose that bishop. And B3 is a sensible square to sit on. Okay. The point is that actually this is a weakness. This potentially in the future, if all the pieces get traded off and we get into some form of endgame, your black's plan will be to pick off this pawn, win it, and then win an endgame pawn up. So white always kind of wants to keep in his back pocket the potential of bailing out, playing d5, swapping that weak pawn off for this e6 pawn, and then reaching a completely equal, or at least a more symmetrical position without a weakness. So this b3, bishop on b3, makes sense because it's still supporting this d5 square, so in case white needs to bail out potentially in the future. Okay. So bishop b7 was played, and now I think basically Abasov made this decision to bail out. As I mentioned, the bishop on b3 supports this d5 push. If he was to do something else, so he took on f6. If he was just to carry on making normal moves, so let's just say, for example, we go bishop c2 with the idea of going sort of queen d3 and sort of mating ideas over here. Okay, so the way that black typically responds to or a typical plan for black in these isolated queen pawn positions is to park a knight on d5. We want to place a knight on d5. Knights are fantastic blockaders because they're the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So we're going to put our knight onto d5. So now I've got this option of coming back to d5. So it's a fantastic blockader. It can jump over that pawn, so it still does lots of work from this d5 square. So it doesn't necessarily need to play it straight away. But once this once the knight sits on d5, it stops that pawn coming forward, and then black can get to work at swapping all the pieces off. So instead of this, I'd probably play something like rook c8, and then only when forced to go back, I would come back. And if takes, we play something like takes. And now I'm going to sit a piece on d5 for as long as I can, and I'm going to swap all the pieces off. Once all these pieces are kind of swapped off, then I will go to work at winning this d5 pawn and potentially winning an endgame. So this is the reason that I think Abasov basically decided, right, enough's enough. I don't want to risk losing this game, so I'm going to take on f6, play very conservatively, and just swap everything off. And now the weakness is gone. Nepo responds by playing knight a5, attacking the bishop, also opening up his own bishop to have more scope. was not possible to take here because of this neat little tactic. Takes, and then the fork. Picks up the bishop, so 2 pieces are better than a rook generally, or rook and a pawn in this case. White would be better in this position basically. So always check for forcing moves. So forcing moves are checks, captures, and threats. So this is the way to not miss sort of simple tactics like this. So for example, you should always be looking for checks. So the first thing I would always look for is a check. So check here is no good because of knight takes. And then when you encounter a problem, you think, okay, the knight would take me there. So what happens if I get rid of the knight? So that's a forcing move. I'm winning a piece if you don't take me back. And now I have my check that picks up the bishop. So this is how sort of with practice, when you're always checking forcing moves, then you don't miss these tactics. Knight a5 threatens the bishop. If nothing was done, then when the bishop gets taken, this knight is now sort of undefended. So white takes on f6 and queen takes. Now, white has to be really, really careful here because black's pieces are a little bit better. So this pawn is undefended, so loose pieces again. Everything's defended in black's camp, but this pawn is loose. This bishop is threatening to take here, threatening to double pawns here as well. So white has to be very, very careful. And I suspect that white had already worked out what he was going to do before taking on f6. He'd already worked out that queen d4 is sort of the only move really to sort of keep it being equal. If he, for example, plays something like rook c3, then what would black do? So what I would suggest to my students, I ask, right, which pieces are being lazy? Which pieces are not doing anything? But this queen is working hard, it's got lots of scope. This bishop is working hard. This knight is threatening to take this bishop at the right moment. Otherwise, knight's on the rim of dim, as we know, so I'd be thinking about moving that. However, my rooks are sitting here doing nothing. So rook f8 hits the queen, gains time. And then after here, takes, I place my bishop on a better square, so in the center is better. Okay, so if you want to work out how good a piece is, roughly you can sort of count how many squares it can go to. So this bishop can go to sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 squares, maybe 5. But on d5, it can go to a lot of squares. It's got a lot of scope. It's always going to be better if it's defended sort of in the center. So bishop d5 with a tempo. And then, so within 3 moves, all my pieces are better. Okay, so black is going to be slightly better in this position. And if we compare it to this position here, where the rooks are being lazy, the knight's sat on the side of the board, and this bishop here is on a nice diagonal. However, if we zoom forwards a couple of moves, then all of black's pieces are optimally placed here. Okay, so and he would have a chance at least to play for a win because he has a better piece placement. The bishop is going to be better than the knight because there are not any good squares for that knight to sit on. So he at least have a chance to play for this for a win. Queen d4 just neutralizes everything, threatening to take the queen and messing up the pawns on f6. So queen takes, the rook comes into the game, threatening the knight, and when it's defended, the knight then takes the bishop, and the bishop comes to d5. So just improving the placement of the bishop. So bishop d5 sneakily protect against the threat that white has. Okay, so rooks like to be on 7th, and potentially this rook will come down to e7, and if white can take over the 7th, then he's going to be very happy. So bishop d5 kind of says, okay, why don't you come down? put your rook here. Well, the problem is after bishop takes, forcing move again. Always check if forcing moves. The rook is actually being attacked. Okay, and yeah, okay, you might be able to take the rook, but now, unfortunately, this back rank is unguarded, and these pawns are blocking the king from getting off that back rank. So when the bishop is recaptured, then there is going to be a mate. Okay, so you're always in a little bit of danger if potentially in endgames the king, if one of the pawns hasn't moved, you watch out for back rank mates when there's rooks on the board. Bishop d5 also introduces the threat potentially of taking that knight, doubling the pawns and giving whites the worst pawn structure. But Abasov just says, I don't really care about that. I'm going to play f3, get rid of my back rank issues potentially, and allow the king to come back into the centre of the board where it belongs in an endgame. One thing you do have to be careful of doing the basics right. When your opponent does have a bishop and you're approaching an endgame, you have to be very, very careful when you're choosing to put your pawns on the same coloured same coloured square as the bishop. Okay, so on black squares, that bishop can't touch these pawns, but on white squares it can. Now this is not very important in this position, otherwise you wouldn't have played this move. However, when you are getting close to endgames, it's important to be wary of what colour square your pawns are on. So f3 was played, and Nepo took on b3, and then took on d1, and played rook c8. So he's saying, you've got the d file, but I've got the c file. Okay, and he's threatening to come in on that second rank potentially, where rooks belong. And Abasov says, nope, you're not coming in onto the second rank. Let's keep all these defended. So the weaknesses in his position are these two pawns. Now, the b3 pawn can only be sort of attacked from this square or from the third rank. And this pawn on b2 sort of covers c3, this rook covers d2, so all bases covered basically. Now the king starts coming towards the centre, as it should in an endgame, and yeah, there's lots of ways of making the draw here. However, Abasov chooses to cut this king off and says, yeah, okay, you want to come to the centre, you're not coming, sorry, while I have a clear route potentially to come towards the centre. Okay, so this is a technique that you can use sometimes in rook endgames. You can use your rook to sort of cut your opponent's king off from where it wants to go. Nepo says, actually now I'm going to come in on the third rank and attack your pawn. And something that white has to be very careful to guard against. Okay, so he plays here so that he can go rook e3. If he just ignored this threat, and again that's another sort of basic thing for the beginners really, always ask yourself after your opponent has played his move, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? If this threat was ignored, say for example I just brought my king here instead, then it's going to be quite an uncomfortable endgame a pawn down. Now there's no way of defending this pawn. Okay, both of these are attacked at the same time, but one of them is going to drop off. It's not completely lost. The game is not over, but there's still work to do for black, but technically that endgame would be winning. King f2, rook here, and now they just repeat moves. No one's going to make progress here. Black's king can't come towards the centre. White only has one weakness on b3. Generally, not always, but generally if you're going into an endgame and you're trying to win it, you kind of need to have two weaknesses to play against. If there's only one weakness, your opponent can focus all their forces on that pawn, or all that weakness, and defend it. If there's two weaknesses, you can sort of play them against each other and make some headway basically. So that is where the game ended, repeating. Nepo happy to play solidly. Abasov obviously is an underdog in this tournament, and he was very happy to take a draw in this first round as well. Please join me for round 2 tomorrow, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, tell your friends about it if you found it useful. Thank you very much.